Um, Again, this right now, the NIWRC, which is the organization that I work for, I will upholds grassroots advocacy and promotes social change to address violence against Native women, children, and families. NIWRC is dedicated to strengthening the sovereignty of Indigenous nations, Native Alaskan Native villages and communities, Native Hawaiian communities, and many, many other tribal and indigenous communities across Turtle Island. So NIWRC is dedicated to strengthening the sovereignty of indigenous nations, of Native nations, and also enhancing the capacity to respond to violence against Native people crimes, particularly within domestic and intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and also to increase the safety and also enhance tribal leadership so that we enhance safety for all Native communities, women, and children. So just a little disclaimer here. This PowerPoint was made possible by a grant from the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, Family and Youth Services Bureau, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So yeah, just had to have that little slide in there because we are, funded by FIPSA. So yeah, this is me. Okay. After this slide, I'm probably gonna shut off my video because I do want to focus on, the content, but also I'm in res land right now. So my internet signal is so precious. And so just to effectively communicate with you all, but I am going to be coming off, to, engage in discussion with you all. And of course that can happen in chat, but also during a small part of this time that we have together, we're going to be going into breakout rooms as well. So I'm just going to introduce myself really quick and then we'll go ahead and get started. So like what was mentioned before, my name is Kim Zani. I'm also known as Sapove or tobacco flower within my community. And I am Satoa or tobacco clan from the village of Tewa within Hopi Nation. So yeah, I'm here. My title, my title or whatever I do. I am the TTA specialist for the training and technical assistance team within NIWRC. I currently live in Arizona on Diné land, but very close to Hopi Tuxtla. So where I'm from, we always go back and forth. I actually have 4 kids and one is in college. 2 of them actually take that very long, bumpy dirt road bus drive to Hopi High School every day. And I have another kid who's actually going to be attending ASU prep academy soon, and he's a little dude. Yeah, he's a third grader. So just really quick about me. Oh, and I'm an Aries, so fire up to all the Aries signs out there. So just wanted to throw that out there really quick. Okay. So before we get started, and I think the title of this presentation, Re-Indigenizing Trauma-Informed, practice, not just practice, but responses, advocacy within Indigenous communities. I feel that we cannot start that conversation until we really get into the understanding that our world previously, before contact and settler colonization and the initiation of settler colonization and oppression, is still very much a part of our lives. Our answers are very much linked in terms of addressing trauma, addressing violence to the nature and the circumstance of settler colonization and settler oppression. And more importantly, we have to ask ourselves, are we taking into context human rights and social justice of communities that we are serving? And if we are so, how are we doing that? So of course, the collective traumas of colonization affect nearly 100, not just nearly, I kind of want to take that word out, but of course, but 100% of Indigenous peoples, not just within the North Americas, but also all across the globe. So I just want to say that historical trauma very much manifests itself in ways that undermine Indigenous community, Indigenous healing, Indigenous, even our cultural practices, and that to also recognize that internal oppression, a symptom of historical trauma, is also very much a prime example of this. So I really, before one thing, when I start with this conversation, I always read this quote from Sarah Deer, and it states, a particular instance of sexual assault is not an isolated event. It is a legacy of oppression and violence. I see that so many good rape crisis centers that do great work around issues of oppression, patriarchy, subjugation, racism, sexism, and all of the other isms, but not a single mention of colonialism. Native women must talk about colonialism because it is such an important aspect of our experiences. And this is also within Sarah Deer's book, and I highly recommend you read it. And of course, I think not just talking about sexual assault in that context, but also within intimate partner violence, dating violence, and domestic violence. I think this quote very much, before we can really address the issues and the challenges that we are having in responding to violences that are affecting Indigenous people, we have to talk about what are the roots of violence, especially within Native communities. So our perspective, the Indigenous perspective, we have to focus our attention on the historical and social context of people's lives, including their ongoing experiences of oppression, discrimination, and of course the microaggressions that they experience, not just occasionally, but what we experience daily. Even if we are rooted in our communities, even if we live in our communities, to say that Native communities don't experience microaggressions within their own circles is completely false. So when we're talking again about that historical context of trauma, colonization, and oppression, we have to remember all of the things that have impacted and that journey, that historical journey, and that survivorship that exists, not only with Native survivors of IPV and domestic violence, but every single person in here who identifies as Indigenous or as Native. We have experienced, and we come from these experiences. And those experiences, if we get further into trauma and we start talking about how those things are embedded in our DNA and etc., I'm sure many of you in this room, in this space, have had trauma training before, and we have not only been affected by this, but we are currently still experiencing these challenges and these oppressions. So I think it helps us to recognize the richness and the complexity of Indigenous communities and our identities, our beliefs and our experiences, but also the traditions and values and relationships that serve for us and also for survivors as sources of meaning and strength. It also places the creation of our services and what we want that to be and what we want that to look like. And we'll go ahead and get into it with this next one. Or no, actually, we'll be one more slide when we start talking about that. So when we're addressing the cultural, historical, and community context of trauma, when survivors come through the door, they call us. It may not be for the particular reason that our organization.
Wait, juvenile one is somebody else. Because juvenile one separated the two parties.
I'm sorry, somebody is unmuted. Can you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that, y'all. So when, of course, hold on, I kind of got I got zapped for a minute. But of course, when each community, each Indigenous community, and I say this constantly, we are not a monolith, right? We all exist almost distinct from one another, even though we may have parallels and we cross over culturally or ceremoniously or spiritually. We are still completely almost separate, distinct nations and communities. Just like survivors of intimate partner violence, just like survivors of domestic violence, we will not all experience our traumas exactly the same. And that goes for this for each community. Now, I am sure that, like I said before, we have all attended trauma trainings, but Native peoples, one thing that many don't realize is that our traumas are not only layers. So if you look at the PowerPoint slide, historical, community, intergenerational, intersectional, individual traumas that we may have undergone, we also, those things very much reflect, if you come from an Indigenous community or any other marginalized community, that this perspective also includes the ongoing experiences of oppression, discrimination, microaggressions, and injustice we may undergo. So, for instance, in that little bar where it says community, that's maroon, and I had this in the previous slide before, so I'll just go back really quick. So within my community, this picture speaks a million thousand words, and this picture is reflective of the Hopi men in my community, and they are all posing in a picture, and they're about to be sent to Alcatraz, or they're probably already at Alcatraz, because they were sent to Alcatraz because they refused to have their Hopi children sent to boarding school. And they refused and refused and refused. And because of that, they were sent to Alcatraz for, I think, a few years. And it wasn't because they were violent or because they did some kind of crime, but just because they Hopi people, and I'm sure all Native communities across the board, understand that the futures of our Indigenous community, when it comes to the passing down of language, knowledge, traditional stories, and each of one of those provides a way of identity that strengthens our existence, but also they understood that Indigenous children are the futures of communities. So when we talk about, the context of trauma and how it impacts, it is all of these things. So when we finally go down to that individual level, when we're serving Indigenous communities, we must understand that not only does that individual, that survivor, come with the experiences of them surviving a violent relationship and a violent, but it may also be interlayered with the rest of their history as a community, as a Native person, as, someone who has survived intergenerational traumas, someone of an intersectional identity. They might identify as Black, Indigenous, who is queer, and also experiencing many other intersections on top of their what they are seeking services for, or what they're seeking assistance for. So, of course, within Indigenous, we have these oppressions that we have community members that experience not only oppression from, the Western society and have a long history there, but we also may have come from communities where we experience internalized oppression, where we're enacting those injustices that we have survived because of colonization, but we also are enacting those violences upon one another. And these listed are the things that can happen when we experience both of those things. So, of course, when it comes to advocacy, this not only happens with, people who are surviving violence, but also with us as systems, with us as, we want the best for our communities. us as a worker, me as an advocate, trying to, help and strengthen community, we also may experience these, internalized oppressions within our community. So when we are looking at the social context specifically of violence against Indigenous women and violence against our Indigenous relatives, particularly, it comes with all kinds of impacts. And I just want to say, I just recently came back from a training called the Specialty Institute. And one of the intersections of violence that we addressed during that training was survivors who use substances, survivors who are having challenges with mental health, survivors, importantly, also who are trying to survive and work their way through intimate partner violence. Not only do we see all these systems that unfortunately aren't made for Indigenous peoples, but that is what we have. And this is the presentation that I'm coming to you with, is not only do we have to understand that we got to expand our reach beyond the criminal justice system. Yes, the criminal justice system is helpful, but we also have other systems that we have to really strengthen in terms of trauma-informed approaches, trauma-informed advocacy. And to say that trauma-informed advocacy only happens within, domestic violence or sexual violence advocacy, you are completely wrong. Trauma-informed practices, approaches can happen in any system. It can happen in healthcare. It can happen in, community, grassroots organizing. It can happen even in criminal justice systems, in trauma-informed courts. It can happen all across Indigenous communities. But what's important is also to understand that our relatives and us as advocates, or us as professionals, we must first start with a context of understanding of how violence impacts our communities, but more importantly, the intersections and also the impacts of how colonialism has impacted our community further, that will limit resources, and that will maybe only have narrow approaches to certain challenges. And I say with this presentation, we have to expand on that. So so this is me. Earlier, I showed you all a picture of me in my little jacket suit and everything, and my nice little profile pic. But this is actually me. I come with so many layers. If I were to introduce myself, of course, one thing I always share is that not only am I an advocate for my Native community and also working with the NIWRC, but I'm also a survivor of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. I'm a survivor, a child sexual assault survivor. I come from, a community which is on the bottom right that is actually not Hopi, but we are Tewa community that have traveled from New Mexico to fit into and absorb the Hopi and become absorbed within the Hopi community. I also have, if you can see that top picture there where we're all in red, where it says Buti Pasiketa, which means women are so precious and women are sacred, that I also come from a cohort of women that also have experienced violence just like myself. So all of these things very much impact the experiences that I've had as an Indigenous woman. And what I have to share with you today is my personal experience, and not only me healing as a survivor and continuing on that journey to heal from sexual assault and violence as a survivor, but also I've engaged in this process within my community and with other Indigenous communities across the nation. So now, that long-winded introduction, what exactly does it mean to be trauma-informed? And here is one definition that I got from actually a time where was training, and one person really stated our capacity, well, to be trauma informed is to enhance our capacity to manage our responses in ways that aren't at the expense of other people, ourselves, or our organizations. And I was just like, oh, yes, thank you. But also trauma-informed perspective brings an understanding of the pervasiveness that trauma is and how it impacts not only our survivors, our organizations and communities, but also how it impacts our daily lives. And being trauma-informed also encourages us and helps us to, have these, to encourage systemic changes and actively approach systemic changes to help mitigate creating these services within our, systems. It also normalizes. Trauma-informed approaches normalizes human responses to trauma. It is normal to have, survivors, or basically we normalize that what survivors are going through, and if they're experiencing trauma, that's just a part of, what happens when we experience violence, because our bodies, not just physical, but psychological, emotional, spiritual, cultural, aren't meant to, experience things that way. We aren't meant to, handle that much violence and that much a capacity. Yes, our bodies and our minds and our responses are very resilient in that way. But originally, we're not meant as human beings to handle such huge loads of violence and trauma. So instead, what we do as a trauma-informed advocate, as a trauma-informed organization, we normalize that. We understand that, and we remind ourselves that the quality of our interactions is very, very critical to the process of healing from abuse, violence, and trauma. And a trauma-informed approach provides guidance on how trauma can affect people's experience of services, of response, and more importantly, a trauma-informed organization and advocate, we do all that we can to reduce further traumatization or re-traumatization at every level within our organization. Okay, there we go. So one thing I always encourage all webinar attendees to do is to attend and really look into the center. I call it the center, but it's the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. And they developed this really amazing model with, the guidance of not only NIWRC and all of these, the approaches, but it's called the ARC-T model. So and it stands for Becoming Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma-Informed Organizations. And the key perspectives that they have are very, very amazing. So they have these key perspectives on the outside that is also interchanging and strengthening all the time, but it's also enveloping our inside. The inside of that circle is a survivor-defined approach, physical and emotional safety, hope and resilience, and relationship. And then finally, the inner circle right there is just a reflection of how us being in the center of all that, and that survivors being in the center of all that. So when we understand trauma responses as adaptations to being under siege, when we understand that, then part of our work is also to do everything we can to reduce the likelihood that survivors and our relatives will feel discounted or disempowered in our programs and systems. So a trauma-informed perspective also informs the creation of services and environments that support the resilience and well-being of people. So that we also have so much work, and how we work, the way we work, and the trauma-informed perspective acknowledges the need to support staff also, and to create opportunities for staff and community for reflection and growth in all of that. So going into that, trauma-informed approaches don't exist alone. They're constantly being informed by so much. And that outside, we have to understand that advocacy also doesn't exist alone. Those four perspectives of cultural, historical, and community context, DV violence and sexual violence advocacy, human rights and social justice approach, alongside that trauma-informed approach, these perspectives offer an important dimension that inform how we conceptualize and do this work, and how we work with communities. And I think one huge one that I'm a huge fan of, like I stated before, is not only the cultural, historical, community context, so understanding that we talked about earlier, but also the human rights and social justice. We have to incorporate human rights and social justice perspectives, because they ensure that the awareness of those conditions, those oppressive conditions, or those injustices that create and uphold abuse, violence, and oppression and discrimination within our lives and our communities and society as a whole, remains central to all that we do in terms of approaching that. So it strengthens our ability to recognize social justice, social injustice, and to also critically assess and analyze those conditions that produce violence, that uphold violence, that uphold abuse. And we all work together toward a social change. What are the steps of social change? And more importantly, how do we act that out? But it also helps us to be a little bit more attuned to any stigma or discrimination experienced by survivors themselves, the staff, in our own programs. And then we have to actively take this into consideration, and also actively self-assess our programs. So a part of that, we're next going to go talk about the middle circle right there. The physical, emotional safety, hope, resilience, relationship and connection, and survivor defined approach. So that next one, the question we want to ask is, are we addressing physical and emotional safety? So a key aspect of being accessible, being culturally responsive, and also being trauma informed is we involve attending to both physical safety and emotional safety. And more importantly, we put this within the definition of survivors. We aren't going to, create that definition, but we are simply going to lean on to survivors and ask what is physically and emotionally safe, or how do they define that safety to them, with particular attention to cultural safety and accessibility. We want to also honor that each person's understanding of what that safety means and what it means for them, and make a commitment as ourselves, as if we're on this journey to becoming trauma-informed organizations, we have ongoing self-reflection. We have ongoing self-evaluation. So whether that approach or that commitment must happen at every level. It has to happen as a system. It has to happen as a policy. It has to happen through procedures. And we want to facilitate, but more importantly, we want to center and facilitate feelings of safety among not only survivors and those we are serving, but also as a staff person. So if I'm in a leadership position, in order for me to become, in order for us to become a trauma-informed organization, we also have to take into account the emotionally emotional and physical safety of staff. And when we address that, we are also addressing that huge word of burnout. And so when we take a trauma-informed approach, also addresses burnout as well. And I can have a completely 6-hour workshop on just that, but unfortunately we don't have time for that. But please come to me if you're interested. So another thing is, are we fostering relationships and making connections, which is also a part of that inner circle? And with Native people, relationships are central to healing, growth, and change, including our relationships, especially with Native people, relationships to people, relationships to places, relationships to practices, but more importantly, relationships to things, ideas, perspectives that help us cope, grow, and thrive. Native people have already embedded genetics and life ways and sustaining practices of resilience. And that is not what I'm talking about. But instead, we have to center relationships that will help with that resilience, because we can't just survive on resilience alone. But what we can do is, what we want to do is center relationships that help us grow, cope, and thrive. And as harm or violence occurs in any relationship, the quality of our relationships and interactions of responding to that violence, post-violence or post-leaving a relationship, or even within the middle of a violent relationship, the quality of our relationships and interactions has the potential to facilitate healing from experiences of violence. This healing also can create a sense of connection and belonging. And with Indigenous communities, when we connect Indigenous survivors back to culture, back to identity, we also are connecting them back to connection and belonging. So when trust has been betrayed, how do we respond to that? And many people will say, oh, we build trust. But more importantly, we got to be more specific. So building trust also requires being honest, being clear, being transparent, and more importantly, being consistent and relating in ways that are genuine. And that includes that big word, right? And we're going to talk about this in a bit, but respect, collaboration, and also existing in a way, in a practice that is non-hierarchical. That is essential to creating safety and building trust. So when we're talking about advocate survivorship relationship, we want to build a relationship where I'm not above a survivor. I'm not looking down on them. And I mean this literally and figuratively, but instead I'm right there alongside them. I have a non-hierarchical relationship, and I'm also going to create organizations that support that. So next question is, finally, does our systems reflect survivor resilience, hope, and strength? So this can include believing in the human capacity to survive, to heal, to thrive, and recognizing the strengths, resources, and the tools that survivors already possess that are central to holding up hope and resilience. And I'm going to say these things already exist within Native communities. So the important thing when you're working, trying to become or making that journey to becoming a trauma-informed organization, these things already exist within Native communities. But the important thing is to tap into that, to ensure that we're creating a steady source straight to this hope. And we're acknowledging, we're validating, we're naming and reflecting on this, on our Indigenous communities, peoples, and survivors, profound resilience, because these are the critical parts of supporting survivors while they heal from trauma. And it also means that us as an organization, us as a practitioner, us as a professional, we are also embodying this genuine sense of openness in the relationships that we are creating with those we are serving, but also within our work and internally within organizations themselves. So, and lastly, we want to ask, do survivors define our approaches, organizations, and advocacy? So within this pictures that you see, everyone here is a survivor of not only violence, but also a survivor of many different kinds of traumas, and bringing people together is really, really important. But also not just the bringing together, but also the recognizing and the honoring and the highlighting of each person's right, their right to define and determine what works for them. That is not on organizations and advocacy programs to define that. No, we're going to put that choice, that empowerment back into those who we serve. And through choice and the empowerment of control, we are giving that back to the experiences of a survivor-defined approach. So when we do that, we are centering survivor-defined approaches. We're defining survivor-centered programming. And this means taking cues and guidance from survivors, including our elders, including our children, including our youth, about how our programs and our services are functioning and how they are operating on a day-to-day. So we aren't just taking, oh, I'm sorry about that, but we aren't just taking this cue from adults. Yes, adults may be, our main contributors to our programs, but we also have other people who are accessing our services, and that includes children. That includes our elders. That includes so many different components and layers of within our community, and we have to try to touch on all of them. So also a survivor-defined network means that we are also working to acknowledge and confront together, not just one organization doing this, but trauma-informed communities means that we are jointly as partners, as social change agents, we are confronting the power imbalances within our communities. And we are working to change those conditions and ensuring that violence in our communities and our within our communities, but it is not going to be tolerated. And we can do that in different ways, but more importantly, we're creating partnerships with the understanding that we are confronting power imbalances within our communities, but also we can do that within our organizations as well. So a trauma-informed approach is all of these things. When we understand that trauma-informed approaches and trauma responses, they're adaptations, like I said before, that are under siege when these trauma and responses are happening and are very natural to, and these are human responses to what happens when violence is upon us. So a trauma-informed perspective also informs that the creation of services and environments that support resilience and well-being, that it will help us reflect and on the work that we do and the way that we work. So just wanted to reiterate that really quick. So trauma-informed practices also honors people's strengths and creativity. That foster resilience and healing, that attend to the well-being of staff, organizations, communities, and that support activism and social change. So one quote from Fallett, along with Roger Harris, along with Maxine Harris, they all state that trauma-informed practices are not designed to treat symptoms or syndromes related to sexual or physical abuse. Instead, they are intended to provide services in a manner that is welcoming and appropriate to the need of trauma survivors. So that quote just simply means we are not here to fix anyone. We are here to provide support, to provide a safe space, to provide choices and empowerment so that the people that we are assisting, they will create that reality for themselves. And this is a quote from Aurora Levens Morales. And Aurora is a Puerto Rican, a writer, poet, and she is so significant within the Latina feminism and third world feminism, as well as other social justice movements. But a quote that I love from Aurora is, "We are led by those who most know these systems." And it's not the people who are working in the systems. It is by those who have been probably most traumatized by the systems who are using these systems to, to try to meet a challenge. Those people are who we have to look towards to lead the movements and the change that we are trying to create in our communities. So upon that, survivor leadership is important. It's going to lead the way, but it's also an important factor in creating trauma-informed communities. And when we have survivors in positions of decision-making, in positions where they shape programming, they plan, and they develop programs, they create policies, and we put survivors in the position of creating resources and developing services, we have trauma-informed organizations, we have trauma-informed communities, but more importantly, we are very much headed towards the way of survivor-centered advocacy, but also trauma-informed approaches are enhanced and strengthened that way as well. So Indigenous peoples, and this is no this is no surprise to all of you, especially those of you who identify as Indigenous or Native, that Indigenous peoples have already had language, ceremony, cultures that have done and are already doing trauma-informed work. But what we're here to do is understand that the wider ranges of those experiences, the historical context and oppression, that we must also understand that those things were actively stripped away from us. And when we have that context, we are able to do our work better. But more importantly, we are in this work to also provide useful tools that are relevant to a person's challenges, to their strengths, but also to address and see that within, when we're doing trauma-informed work, just like Native communities, during that whole process, we also have to challenge our own biases. We also have to assess where we need the most growth, where we need the most change. And that includes taking a huge look at what we are doing, not necessarily wrong, because professionals and organizations tend to stiffen up when we hear, "Oh, you're doing this wrong, or you doing this incorrect." But what we really need to take a look at is the approach that we are having and that we're taking with communities may not always be for their benefit. We have to also take a stronger look at, are we functioning in an organization where we're making the work easier for ourselves? Or are we in an organization that is going to try to create choices and programs, and more importantly, services for those who we serve? So, and this road also, we must identify that respect and trust, that it happens along these journeys, that we have to look at things like empathy, self-reflection, and the attention to our own responses and needs as organizations, while not impacting or downgrading the needs of those that we serve. So that is a very, very important thing that we also have to take a look at. And one thing I want you to ask of all of you, and please put this in the chat, is what is your definition of re-indigenizing? And you can throw that in the chat. You can shoot it my way. If you don't want to share that with the whole group, you can send me a personal DM to, myself or those who are facilitating this this session. And so what is your definition of re-indigenizing? And what does that encompass? Making Native values mainstream again. Yes, thank you, Kristen. Remembering who we are and understanding where we come from. Thank you, Pat. That is that. Oh, yes. Reconnection. Yes. Recentering Indigenous culture, Indigenous lives. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Stacy. To have Native people and their worldviews be decision makers and decision-making processes. Thank you. Please give me an example of community trauma response. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't supposed to share. All right. Sorry about that. Reconnection of your culture. Definitely. Thank you, Lisa. Escalate. Recognizing Indigenous strengths and use them for healing. Yes. Thank you, Patricia. Return to our humanity. Yes. It's so interesting when I have this discussion with people, and they always ask me, like, what is your definition of Hopi, or what does it mean to be Hopi? And I actually had a conversation with a clan matriarch, and it wasn't even my own clan, but it was a Corn Clan lady. And Corn Clan ladies are so wise because they're very close to earth, they're very close to life, and then they protect that knowledge of what it means to bring life into the world, not only as clan mothers, but also as seed keepers of communities. And I remember this one clan person, and she stated that anybody can be Hopi. And she's like, I'm not talking about blood quantum. I'm not talking about like being born from a Hopi mother, but what it means to be Hopi is to be human. It means reciprocity, humility. It means the stewardship of land. It means taking care of your community. It means putting yourself last. And when you put yourself last and you lead from the back, just like how Coyote Clan does, they take care of everyone and they put community first, then we see things from a different perspective. We see things from a different point of view. Awareness and connection to our Indigenous power and knowledge. Thank you. Putting Indigenous people at the forefront of leadership and decision making. Yes. Reconnecting to cultural practices, incorporating them daily, starting them young and teaching them, starting them run Indigenous way of life, returning back to our identity, rebuilding our strength, returning power to the Native people and recentering them to their life values. Definitely. But I think when I talk about re-indigenizing, and a lot of you have addressed this, but more importantly, I think when we're talking about language is that right? But the reinstallment or the rematerialization, the is so important when it comes to language. And it's just basically talking about transforming our ways of thinking, being, and action into not necessarily what we have done since the beginning of time, right? But those perspectives, those, re-indigenizing can involve recognizing and embracing, and not just our own Indigenous worldviews, but others. But more importantly, our identity as an Indigenous worldview of languages, stories, insight, perspectives. It can also mean reincorporating Indigenous principles into so many things, not just healthcare, not just advocacy, but also government, institutions, systems, policies, and practice, and starting and founding us there. It can be rebuilding our relationships and our connections to one another through clanships, through villages, through, however we define and once what we defined as connection and how we identify kinship. Re-Indigenizing can also involve committing to rebuilding relationships with our communities. What does that look like, and how is it played out, and how can we strengthen that? And we can also welcome our land's history and reintroduce that back to our people and who live there. And one thing that I always say to many programs across the lands and across Indigenous, community is, again, coming back to our relationship with land. And by land, it could be anything from exploring our foods and our medicines and building a deeper connection with nature, not just plant life, but all life. All life that includes, land, rock, tree, our, relatives that are winged, that are four-legged, that all life. And that includes our elements, right? That includes fire, that includes water, that includes air. And when I say air, people are like, what do you mean? Like the wind? I had like, how do you reconnect back to air? And another thing that one person said to me was like, well, reconnecting back to air can also mean tobacco. The tobacco that is smoked for prayer, specifically in my community, where does it go? It goes up, So that's a reconnection. Well, and people say, well, I don't live near water, I don't live near water like our indigenous waters that are rivers where my land is at, or our springs. So how can I reconnect back to water that way? And one whole program was the way they reconnected back to water was through song, right? And someone was like, song? How does that? That's not reconnecting back to water. And I was like, actually, like biology, like if y'all took anatomy and biology, one of the when you're talking about the Krebs cycle, right? One thing that our body breathes out is not only carbon dioxide, which is an air element, but also water. Our body breathes out water as a natural element that we let go of. So when we engage in song, when we engage in singing, when we engage in discussion, talking circles, when we engage in teaching and training, that is water that we are releasing to our relatives. So that's just an example of how to re-indigenize our thinking. So when we're teaching our loved ones, or our colleagues, or when we're singing a song to our, someone who is in need of healing in a talking circle, or even when we're saying a prayer and starting off our coworkers for a new day or for an event so that we all come out of it safely and stronger, a way we can reconnect to water is simply by breathing, by singing, by teaching. So that is another way of how we can re-indigenize our practice and our contributions to, our organizations, but also to each other. Return to our puberty ceremonies as well as our Indigenous youth, so they recognize then the transition from youth to adulthood. Yes, definitely. And one thing I've noticed, like puberty ceremonies, or society, when we're entering Native communities into new societies, but also when we want to incorporate that into programming and healing, is that why do those ceremonies exist? Not only for the transition, right? But one thing I always taught is because it's trying to build strength in us, and the building of strength and moving on to, I've talked with people who have done their puberty ceremonies, and I always talk with a person who was going through that. And they say, it was so hard, when I was grinding corn, I almost didn't finish. And and then they talk about all these insecurities and doubts that they're having. And one of the things that I remember saying to my niece is like, yeah, because, you know, that is what our life is like. Our life is that hard. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. But one thing to remember is when you're going through those ceremonies is that you have all of those people around you. And just like that ceremony, that those people are going to continue to be around you for the rest of your life. So when we're you know, doing these, and I'm not talking just about ceremonies, but also about the events that we hold, whether if that's awareness, outreach, or whatever, we also have to recognize that we have partners there, and that, you know, we're going to have growing pains, you know, in a training, and it's when we're trying something new. But we also have to, when a way of re-indigenizing those partnerships and strengthening them is recognizing the partnerships that helped us, you know, through those pains, that were there to support us, that were there to even teach us, saying, hey, I saw this happen, maybe next time we should do this. And that is a re-indigenizing concept that we can also have within our organizations and implement that into our practice as an org. So re-indigenizing is also a reclamation. We are reclaiming something and remembering it. And being Indigenous is something that is always there, but the re-indigenizing act itself is reclaiming that we have always been here. We are going to continue to be here. But more importantly, it allows us to see things that we have not seen before. For instance, that the violence that we experience as not only just women, but also other genders, and that violence is very much related to the violence that is committed against environment, and that they're interconnected. That when we are re-indigenizing, we are also engaging in so many things that are interconnected to strengthening our being as a Native person, but also as a human. So when we have non-Native people there in our spaces, we are also teaching them what it means from our perspective to be human. And this also includes food sovereignty, reproductive justice, economic justice. But more importantly, we are also introducing concepts of Indigenous sovereignty. And I'm not talking just about, you know, like councilman, like I'm on council. I'm not just talking about that Indigenous sovereignty, but individual individual self-sovereignty. What does that mean? What does that look like? What is self-determination? Define that from our communities, not from tribal governance, even though those things, yes, they're very important, but how do we define self-determination? How do we define different concepts like permission, the permission of self, the permission of others to touch, or what does that process look like? And in the end, when we're re-indigenizing nations, practice, even the re-indigenizing of self, we aren't just in the work to end violence. In that process, when we strengthen individual self-identity, and this includes work with survivors, includes work with those who are experiencing substance use, and all of those, of any challenge that we are within Native organizations that are having challenges within their community. We aren't just ending violence. We aren't just ending poverty. We aren't just ending oppression, but we are also nation building, because we are all in agreement of identifying what it means to be Indigenous, but also in that process, when we begin to come to the idea of what is good for our community, how we can serve and help one another, we are building nations in that moment. So when we're building nations and we're, coming into our role as advocates and as humans, being culturally relevant and trauma informed is so critical. So we are not only becoming stronger advocates, we are also in that journey, we're becoming stronger human beings. We are humanizing and growing together. And becoming Indigenous is not something we earn with blood quantum, becoming Native, becoming Indigenous is a process. There are things that we learn, our histories, our languages, but more importantly, just these small, very strong concepts of how we treat each other. So there is no destination in becoming a human being, right? We are always trying to strive and improve upon this process. So I want to have you all challenge yourselves in that process. Just because we have a building and we have a policy and we have, these things that make us a program, we aren't fully that program when we meet one goal, but instead we want to say we are striving in becoming the program that we want to see like 150, 10 years down the road. So when we are culturally relevant and trauma informed, not only is re-indigenizing work acknowledged in that, but also decolonial work is acknowledged and validated in that. Marginalized communities are historically and currently to this day experiencing disadvantages. So we want to validate with that experience by practices and even text, like within our policies and procedures. We want to use terms where we have goals of re-indigenizing or decolonizing, because when we empower communities within a trauma-informed lens, we are also empowering. And when we empower communities, we don't know it, but we are also cultivating leadership. So when we are empowering our communities, when we are empowering survivors, we are also cultivating potential leadership, but also, I just want to say, not just potential, but we're cultivating future leadership in that experience. And holistic experiences are also Indigenous. So when that term holistic, we've always had that term within Indigenous communities. And I just want to say, so holistic just basically means approaches where we see the entire person. We see all that comes with that person, their experiences, their connection to land, or maybe they may have no connection to land. But also we take the whole person. And when we understand that holistic approaches is also about balance, we also understand that in achieving and trying to strive for that balance, we are also entering circles of healing. So how does this help survivors? It helps survivors in so many different ways, right? And we already discussed most, or not most of them, but a few of them. But a strengthening identity is a part of that. We also alter coping strategies that we have always had as Native people. And we acknowledge also the importance and challenges of connections that we have as Native people. We can easily identify why we are having trouble with connection. And not only may be trauma, but it may also be, a discrimination or a system injustice that we also have experienced, or also survivors may be experiencing. So that also acknowledges that. And I want to say, if you haven't looked up or done a training with identifying what strength-based or asset-based approaches are, please do so. Because I definitely see, like, if you look that up, that term of strength-based or healing-based approaches, asset-based approaches, those are definitely approaches that you probably have heard from your grandparents. And but when we reclaim that back into our communities, we're like, oh, okay, this is an Indigenous concept. We've always had this. So it's just kind of like when all these new terms that are coming up, it's interesting that they've undergone like a relabeling, but we have always had those things within our communities. So trauma and healing, of course, this is just that Indigenous peoples, I just want to remind you, even if we have never, I mean, we're all in this, I feel like whenever I introduce myself to like, hey, this is the work that I do, but I'm in the business of putting myself out of work. You know, like I'm in the business of coming into a community where violence no longer exists. I want to not have a job in the future. Like that's kind of like how I introduce myself sometimes when I'm doing workshops. And I just want to say, even if we rid ourselves of DV, IPV, sexual violence, I just want to say that trauma is still going to exist in our communities, just like how it had before. We probably have come from, you know, communities, Native communities, or even those of you who identify as non-Native, we have come from cultural communities, maybe where rape or things like abuse did not like flourish in our communities. I know in some Indigenous languages where they don't even have a Native word for rape, or they don't even have a Native word for DV, because it was just not that it was non-existent, possibly, but also that they were rare occurrences in our communities. So even if we rid ourselves of, you know, of those types of violences that we have had or may have not have had, I just want to say that trauma has always existed within Native communities. And since Native trauma or trauma within Native communities has always existed, we also have had our own way to deal with those things. So now, as when we're decolonizing and, you know, re-indigenizing our communities, we have to be innovative now. We have to expand that. Sometimes our ceremonies may have traditionally not have always been like healing practices may not always been for sexual violence survivors, but because Indigenous peoples are becoming innovative and creative, and that's how we have survived till this day, to incorporate those things and expand that web of healing to include those things is so important. So Indigenous cultural teachings are essential to thriving communities. And we may have also, it's important for us as organizations to tap into the language of the communities that we are serving, and also talk with them about what strengthens them as a community, and what language do they use for communities that they want to be, and to identify with those things. And we want to be able to use that language and identify with it, but not only use it, that language, and slap it on a resource, you know. That is not what I mean. But how does that look like in our programs? We want to instill and we want to walk the walk, right? Not just talk the talk. So if we're going to be saying, hey, yes, healing communities require these things like respect, gyatsi, aging. So we can't just go back and, you know, to our into our organizations that we serve and also not carry those things out. So for instance, gyatsi within my community, or aging, respect, isn't just a word. It's not just saying, oh, I have gyatsi, no, that's not what it means in my community. It means a whole array of behaviors. It doesn't just mean if you say I have respect for you, that's not respect, but it's shown through action. It's shown through how you carry yourself. So if you are to use that concept within the community of programming, and how it's important to have that and how to show it, then we also must be a mirror of that and ensure that we are reflective upon that within our own program as well. And more importantly, how is that embedded in our program? How do we show that? How do we foster it? How do we ensure that respect in our communities? Okay, in the first I do. Yeah, so I just want to say that very much a part of that. I didn't intentionally don't mean to leave out Indigenous men within any of the slides that I have, because I just want to say, even within my community, and one thing that even though we see within our community, not only are men survivors of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, but also men in my community, the Hopi community, are very much part of the solution. And Indigenous men in my community and women and other genders, we all create a space of balance, that we cannot have one without the other. We cannot have one without all, you know? So I just want to say that out there. And that is one thing that NIWRC is working towards right now, that we aren't just in the work to end violence against Indigenous women. That is just something we state because statistically speaking, and of course, I'm referring to statistics that have been in the early 2000s, state that Indigenous women experience so much violence. But now we are seeing that actually the highest rates of violence of intimate partner sexual violence are occurring within Indigenous, queer, LGBTQ2 spirit communities. So because that now that we have identified that to be, then we must also change and grow our organizations and our responses to reflect that need in the community as well. Okay, so here's a term that we have within my community, means samit nangwa, and it is defined as the will to come together to do activities for the benefit of all, out of a compelling desire and commitment to contribute or return something of value or benefit back into the society. And this is done in harmony, not only for self, but all people in the world. So, and this term is just so important to my community. And Beatrice Norton is a clan matriarch within her community. And she states that the only way we lose power as Hopi people is when we stop coming together. So I just want to state that really quick. And then, so we're gonna go ahead and break into to end our time together, because I'm looking at the time and I'm running out of time. But I just want to invite the tech person that is on the call right now to go ahead and break into a room. So right now, I want you to ask this question of the people who you're breaking out into a room with. So first of all, what does reciprocity look like in your community, in your nation, in your village? And more importantly, I want you to identify how you can duplicate one reciprocal act between staff, between survivors and staff, and also between collaborating partners. So I just want you to take one act of reciprocity, and I want you to see if that act can be duplicated within your org, within the people you serve, and then finally within your partners. So we'll go ahead and do that right now. So go ahead and join your group. And we'll do this for 5 minutes, and then we'll end our session for today. Yeah, and then I see people stating that they might have to log off, and that's fine. And then after we do this, we're gonna go ahead and go back into our group. So just click that button that says join a breakout room. And then also, tech person, can you put this question into the chat as well, so that the participants in their chat rooms can see it? Because right now my screen is taken up by a whole by the PowerPoint. So I can't see. I could just see the slide. I can't see the chat right now. I mean, not the chat, but I can't include it in there. Yes.
Well, Kim, or
Yeah.
so the breakout room I attended, there was nobody in there.
I'm moving you around if there is nobody in there. So
Okay.
just hold on a second and I'll move you in with somebody.
Right on. Thank you.
Mhm.
About that.
Same, I don't have anybody in my breakout room either.
Okay, I'm working on it. Oh, there we go. Okay, I think everybody has, oh, right here. Okay, everybody should be.
There is nobody in my breakout room.
All right, I think you should be reassigned and be able to jump into somebody else's one.
And then we'll just bring everybody back in like 3 minutes.
Okay,
Okay.
that was a little difficult because as people, obviously, when they say breakout room, people start dropping off. Oh, here. Hopefully. Okay, best I could here. Okay, it didn't work out as well as we wanted it to, Kim, but
Yeah, I know. That's my fault because I completely went over. So
no, yeah, I should have put more people in a breakout room in the thought that when you say the word breakout room, it's like mass. Choop, 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 choop.
Okay. And you know, we can probably bring everybody back together like
Okay.
in a like maybe give them 1 more minute because there's
Okay,
like
so I close the room and so you get about a minute when you
yeah.
close.
We'll just have everybody just come back together.
So sorry, everybody, if you had to jump in and there was nobody in there.
Okay. Is everybody back?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Well,
So-
you need probably give about another 30 seconds. There's a couple people that must be chatting
Okay.
up.
Okay. And I can just go ahead and get started. So yeah, everyone, I hope that you're able to have like, even if it was like a 30-second discussion about what reciprocity looks like in your communities. And in my community, we do it through food. You know, we do it through the act of thanking someone, whether if it's someone that as you can see in the picture, there's a young man dancing right there. And the way when we dance, when girls or manas dance with their partners, the way they thank them for acting is very reciprocal. So the boy will either give the girl like what is typically male like gifts to be given. So that's usually groceries, meat. You know, sometimes the boy will give the girl a dress that is made by grandparents or aunties or their mom. And then the girls will reciprocate that, you know, whatever they've been given, they usually give like a basket, a plaque, or traditionally they give piki. which is a blue corn paper thin bread that is rolled up. And so one act that we've done, that we've incorporated, and I've seen it done at the Hopi Tewa Coalition, is that whenever they have a presenter or, like survivors that come in and do, focus groups, they still continue to do that traditional act of thanking by food. And another way I've seen this take place is, and the way they've done it within of the awareness events is like if a program shows up to support them, with an event, then they go all out, They'll even take time and volunteer their time to show up at their event, even though they may not typically have done that historically in the past, but that is like a new thing that they have done in the future. So I would love to hear everybody's ideas, but unfortunately we're running out of time and there's just a few of you left right now, or not a few, but we have quite a bit of room left. So this is a saying that we have within our community, and it's called Itam Yaktan Napyani, which means we do this work for ourselves. And it begins with community. So those who are most experiencing violence or a challenge within their community, coming together, that work must start with community and end with community. So even though they may have help along the way to identify challenges and come up with solutions, that work must identify with the community, must be owned by them, and for those things to be carried out. And that is also within trauma informed. And also facilitating and healing and recovery involves all these things, not just safety, meeting, survivors where they are, but identifying where they are from and honoring that, and strengthening those skills that makes them who they are at their best. So whether if this can be a cultural skill, this could be, an emotional building skill that happens during ceremony, and, somehow replicating that way to build that in your program, that is just gold, people. So if you are able to find out how that happens and how to do that, I would say just look for those answers in your community and through, cultural advisors. Spiritual healing also happens within the space. So one quote that I always loved was like, we are spiritual beings on a human journey, not a human being on a spiritual journey. And we do this spiritual healing through so many things within our community. We do it through song, dance, storytelling, artistry, sports, running, cooking, planting gardens, prayer, protecting land. So I want to say, be a little bit more innovative and creative when you're bringing community together. And talking circles doesn't just have to happen in a chair where everybody's just facing each other and staring at each other. But this can happen through, sewing circles. This can happen through, physical activity where we're bringing, a group of people together to run. Because in so many communities, and I want to say every single Native community here have runners, because we had to have a way to carry those messages to one another. But also the act of running for many different communities also involves prayer. So also instilling those things within your, communities and your programs, and going back to how we have done and communicated our challenges before and tap back into those things. Again, utilizing cultural practices in my community, and also being mindful of which practices use which medicine. So in my community, we most commonly use cedar and bear root, but other communities, they may use sweetgrass, sage, all these things that they utilize to heal. But more importantly, I want to say that there's even whole entire journeys about the practices of why, right? Why do we use sage? Why do we use cedar? And even the cultural practices that are served there in using those specific medicines are very vital to not only future healing practices and cultural practices that take place, but also within the storytelling aspect and understanding the root of why those healing practices occur in the first place. So I actually had this quote, and there was this program. It was being done at the local school that my kids actually attend. And they wanted to like have all these different awareness and education programs on like domestic violence, teen dating violence. And instead, I remember at the end of one of those sessions, and this was a Hopi High School senior stating this, and he stated, instead of teaching us young men how not to be violent, instead help us lead our communities and our growth to be Indigenous men that protect, honor, and love matriarchal sacredness and cultural strength. And I was just like, what? I was just like, my mind was blown away. Just that, yeah, because a lot of our teaching as Indigenous people, and this includes men, that we just simply have to put them and encourage them to remember who they are and what their role is in society and why they have the beliefs and practices and roles that they do. But also being very aware that a lot of our also cultural practices and our ways of thinking to identify where some of those teachings have been acculturated, assimilated, or colonized, and to really pick that apart. So that was like the only thing that in terms of developing, you know, boys and young men programs is to also train 1 or 2 men in that program to really identify when colonized thinking or colonized cultural practices or beliefs are taking place, and say, actually, you know, you may have been taught this, but you know, that's actually a colonized behavior. So that is one thing that is very cool in terms of re-indigenizing and being a trauma-informed programs that is taking place in Indigenous communities, instead of, you know, teaching what violence is or how this is how you not, you know, commit violence. Instead, they're just returning back to who they are, and they're learning those things and learning respect and consent and all of these different ways that they have always meant to. And it's creating, you know, a stronger identifying practice and that they are taking on in their communities, and it's being handed down very wonderfully. So the youth, we don't listen to our youth enough, and I just got to say that now. Our youth are inheriting so many challenges and problems, and they are already coming up with the answers for so many things. So for instance, this drum group right here, these boys, actually the young people within the high school, when they have Native Cultural Week, they're the ones choosing the songs. They organize all the practices for Cultural Week. They are the ones singing for their classmates during this week, and they're taking off huge leadership roles. And I swear, this is huge untapped potential right here. So people, if you are having challenges of, oh my gosh, I'm just having a hard time and trying to create what it is that this community need, and trying to be, you know, tapping into a real need for my community. Honestly, our youth already has so many different ideas. I suggest y'all tap into that potential there. Indigenous, and lastly, I think with this slide, this is I want to say, hold on, let me come off video for a second right now. And so Indigenous healing, this is a slide, and it states, healing is a revolutionary act. Healing of self is a revolutionary act. Healing of communities, especially Indigenous, healing of Indigenous communities is the ultimate act of resistance and a path toward liberation. And when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh. And I read it in this book. I don't know if you can see it right here. It's called In My Own Moccasins by Helen Knott. And this is a story of resistance, a memoir specifically of Helen Knott, and how they were able to heal from sexual and intimate partner violence. And it's such an amazing story. And Eden Robinson wrote the foreword to this. So if y'all are, you know, looking for another way to tap into self-healing without without a survivor or without an Indigenous person outing themselves, y'all need to start a book club, like to read about Indigenous experiences of violence, but also survivorship without the readers. Instead, they're identifying with a person in this book and coming and having discussions there. But you know what? a person doesn't have to say, oh, like I experienced that too, but instead they're connecting to the author or to a character in the book. And that is another way that you all can build your, experiences, your programs, and then also a way to tap into healing in terms of through Native literature. So I'm going to end right about now with this awesome quote by Joshua Whitehead, who is an Indigenous Two-Spirit author. And he quotes, "We have already survived the apocalypse. This right now, right here, is a dystopian present. What better way to imagine survivability than to think about how we may flourish into being joyously animated rather than merely alive." And Joshua Whitehead wrote book, I have it over there, I'm just looking at it, wrote Johnny Appleseed. It's about an Indigenous person, and it's so good. I suggest you all read it. But yeah, I am officially concluding my time with you all today, and I appreciate those of you staying a little bit late. I'm sorry to eat into your time, but thank you so much. My name is Kim Zani. This is my email. And if you want to get a hold of me, and if you need, assistance with technical assistance, you need training, you need a resource. If I don't have it, I'm going to dig in, my treasure box to get it for you. I'm going to, that's why we're here. The National Indigenous Women's Resource Center is here to serve as a resource to you all. So if it doesn't involve, domestic or sexual violence and advocacy, or ending violence within Indigenous communities, if you're looking for a youth resource, grant funding, reach out to us and just go on our website, just tap into, just fill out that request, and we'll be able to serve your needs as best as we can. So I just want to say, eskwale, kunaa, and also keep doing the work that you're doing. You guys are doing excellent work, and I see you all, and you all being here for your Native community. So keep going strong. Just with all your hearts and all your minds. And I'll pray for you all, and I appreciate you all being here today. And I'll stay on for a little bit if you all have questions or you need to reach out.